Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. From Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the palatial FYC studios, you are listening to the 7th annual October Frightfest Spooktacular on For Your Consideration.
Ooh.
If you're familiar with this format and FYC in general, welcome back to the show. It's great to see you. If you are new to the program and are unfamiliar with what the Frightfest Spooktaculars entail, essentially, when it comes to October and Halloween, Dustin and I, we don't get enough opportunity to talk about horror movies because when you're talking about these greatest films of all times lists, there's just not a lot of horror movies on there. And we have a great love for the genre, and this is just a great opportunity for us to bring some of those movies in and have discussions about them.
And so every year we've been choosing sort of a theme around which we find some movies and take a look at those once a week. And this year we've decided to go with video games that have been turned into movies. We started last week with Paul W.S. Anderson 2002 movie, Resident Evil.
And this week we're picking up the baton and running with the much maligned 2005 adaptation of the landmark survival horror game series, Alone in the Dark.
Which in this case is more akin to a bunch of people in decently lit rooms where some asshole keeps playing with the dimmer switch.
I'm sure in someone's mind, probably Uwe Boll's mind, it's an instant classic. So the basic format of the episode is Dustin's going to give us a quick summary of the film. Then we're going to talk briefly about kind of our first contact or exposure to either the film or the Alone in the Dark franchise in general. Then we're going to give our basic thoughts on the film. And that's pretty much it. So Dustin, if you want to give us a quick summary of Alone in the Dark.
The game Alone in the Dark is about a middle-aged man named Edward Carnby who's investigating a haunted mansion all alone in 1921. Therefore, the film is obviously about a much younger Edward Carnby in the modern age who is part of a group of orphans who were experimented on as children, and now he happens to also work for a paramilitary organization that investigates the occult, and they're looking into an ancient indigenous civilization that managed to make a portal to another realm, which ended up destroying themselves. And so they apparently had the time to close the portal and spread these pieces all around the world in order to try and keep it hidden away. And
before disappearing off the face of the earth forever.
Just sort of a last dying gasp, I guess. They decided, all right, we're done here. We messed up. We had our chance.
Peace out.
And so, of course, as with every single film that involves an ancient destroyed race, some idiot goes along and decides, well, I'm going to figure out what they did and do it again, because that worked out so well the first time.
It always goes better the second time round. That's just math.
To be fair, it really does, because in none of these movies does a civilization get completely eliminated. So maybe third time's the charm and they learn how to control it.
We can talk about that when we get to discussing the end of this movie. That said, as far as first contact with the film or the franchise in general, I'd made mention in the last episode that I had actually played the Alone in the Dark game, the very, very first one back in I think it was 91 or 92. And it really piqued my interest. It was something that I'd never seen before. It was a 3D game, played it on a friend's PC. And because it was my friend's, I didn't have access to it regularly, and we got interested in other things, and it just sort of fell by the wayside. But it's always kind of been in the back of my head as this game that was really kind of interesting and engaging. So when this film came around, I'd always been kind of curious to see it, but then I just kept hearing all the bad stuff about it. So I honestly hadn't seen the film until I sat down to watch it for this episode. To be fair, it probably wouldn't have changed my life too much to have not watched it at all. But I will say, because Dustin, in your intro, you kind of mentioned the fact that in the first game, Carnby is a middle-aged guy, like in the 20s, basically investigating this paranormal sort of circumstance or whatever. This film is based on the fourth game in the series, which was kind of a reboot. And it was, I believe...
that one.
I believe it was PlayStation 2 and Sega Dreamcast. I think those were the systems that were around at the time. The Dreamcast is the native, it's what it was actually designed for, and it was ported over to PlayStation 2. But it's a much more survival horror-y, tank control, Resident Evil game. Interestingly enough, Alone in the Dark is one of the original survival horror games. It's because of that game that we have games like Resident Evil or Silent Hill or any of the myriad of survival horror games that we have. And then when it comes around to the fourth game, Resident Evil, had already been out and had kind of taken the world by storm. So it kind of adapted itself into a Resident Evil style game, even with like the two characters where you're in this plane and there's something happens and the plane is crashing. You jump out of the plane. Carnby ends up, somewhere near this mansion. Aileen ends up on top of the mansion, and you kind of play both characters, I believe, and you work your way sort of towards each other and towards whatever the main goal is, which is not dissimilar to, Resident Evil 2.
Or Resident Evil 1, really, with
That's true. That's true.
Jill and Chris. And I think Resident Evil 0, Resident Evil 3, no, not 3.
So I had a touchstone for this movie that had created this curiosity many, many years ago. And I love Christian Slater. I really like Tara Reid. Stephen Dorff is another actor that I enjoy. So seeing that cast, being attached to this game franchise, I was like, yeah, this should probably be good. And then stayed away for obvious reasons, like I said. And then visiting it this time around, I have thoughts. I have many thoughts.
Also opinions.
I know you weren't that familiar with the game series.
I was vaguely aware of it as being one of the progenitors of survival horror, but I really got my start with Resident Evil and Silent Hill in terms of the genre and never went back to the older games. I just took a quick look at some gameplay, and it's familiar, but man, is it clunky looking.
Right? So clunky.
So clunky.
I want to make a McClunky joke here.
I was mostly surprised at the fact that it had nothing to do with the movie that I saw. But of course, I mean, it was based off of one of the future games, not the original game. Going into the film, I was mostly aware of Uwe Boll because I've seen about 5 or 6 of his films, and each one is bad. And it's bad in generally the same way, kind of like how Asylum films are all bad in sort of the same way, but they're bad in different ways from each other. And it's very interesting as far as I'm concerned.
There's a whole spectrum of bad.
There absolutely is. There's Troll 2 where it's so bad it's good again. There's Asylum where they're like, I'm going to make this film specifically bad and it's got no heart. So it's just bad. Then there's stuff like Uwe Boll where there's heart. I believe Uwe Boll believes in himself. He is trying to make art. He believes he's making art. And I don't know how much his parents encouraged him and put all of his paintings up on the fridge, but maybe they should have said, you know what, you're 13 now, this finger paint just ain't cutting it.
It's interesting that you bring up, both the Troll 2 and the Asylum movies, because in a way, when you listen to the director of Troll 2, like, it's kind of like The Room of horror movies, right? It's like somebody who just doesn't know. It's very Ed Woodian. They don't know how bad it is, and they're trying so hard, and it's got so much heart and soul in it, but they're just not capable of creating, Citizen Kane kind of thing. Whereas the Asylum is literally, let's create a portmanteau word and then make a movie out of it, and then there you go. And it's...
Or let's take a blockbuster going on, make something that's almost the same so that somebody's grandma is going to get the wrong thing at the bargain bin.
It's not an art thing, it's a commerce thing. And I mean, if I'm not mistaken, like a lot of directors aren't even credited on Asylum films just because...
Oh, they Alan Smithy the crap out of it. I think they've actually banned the use of Alan Smithy at some point, didn't they?
And then you've got Uwe Boll, who he's both. Like his whole modus operandi is based around, I'm going to make movies and it's a commercial thing and they need to make money. And
but the weird thing is his investors are investing into it knowing it's going to fail and treating these movies as a tax shelter because of some weird laws that they have in terms of taxation in Germany.
Yeah, there's something where you literally get 50% of your money back, which is I don't know how that works. I haven't done a deep dive into it. But
Either way, it's cheaper for them to make a movie that fails than it is to just pay your taxes.
and just to complete my thought, despite the fact that he's very much cookie cutter, building block, putting the Legos together to make these movies, he also is trying to approach them from an artistic standpoint because when he talks about them, and we'll probably talk about this later, like he doesn't make apologies for shortcomings. He usually just criticizes other people for not seeing his genius. And he thinks he's making really great stuff. And he might, probably doesn't think it's high art, but he definitely thinks it's like really good quality commercial entertainment. So you got this weird blending of like those two philosophies in this one guy, and it just kind of creates something.
It creates confusion. That's what it creates.
So was this the first time for you watching this movie?
This is the first time I've seen this movie, though let's not pretend that it's so memorable that I couldn't have seen it four times before and simply forgotten. But I can see there's a lot of parts in the film where, as we said, Uwe Boll is trying to do stuff, trying to make it interesting. In the beginning, you have a shootout in the middle of this marketplace,
Oh, Dustin, I
and
got to stop you there because if we're going to talk in the beginning, we need to talk about that 6 minute crawl.
I checked it out again, and yeah, that the crawl, it is. If you had somebody with a decent voice, maybe, or if you just took away the dubbing, but it sounds so amateurish.
Do you
Just
know who's actually reading the crawl?
I do not.
That's Uwe himself.
He does not have his voice has zero gravitas whatsoever.
And like
I've
for real,
heard crawl. Yeah, you could have a crawl where it's getting you in there, and you can have a crawl where it sounds like you just picked some random person off the street, and you can guess which one this is.
I have seen so many films that have crawls before them where they're generally mandated by the studio because somebody in the audience or in the executive suite is confused by something and they're like, we need to explain the movie before the movie starts. Blade Runner has a crawl. Buckaroo and Banzai had a crawl. I think Legend has a crawl. But that didn't make any of those movies bad movies. You just put a crawl and you kind of told the bare bones of what you needed to tell. This is literally like, I mean, the only thing I can compare it to is if you're in a video game and you discover a journal and then you have to like flip through the 8 pages that the developers, wrote of backstory in the journal before it gets stored in your inventory and then like you can move on. Because it's long. There's so much there. And I don't know if he just overcompensated or if it's just his own hubris or if it's his way of flipping the bird at them by giving them this ridiculously long crawl. But I don't know. It's not the most auspicious start to this movie.
It does kind of feel like it has the quality, though, that as soon as you see that crawl, you know exactly what to expect for the rest of the film. You're not going to be surprised. And it doesn't hurt at all that immediately you're met with sort of the lighting that's a little bit too bright, and it feels a bit soap opery in terms of the what you're looking at. I almost feel like some of the backgrounds were CG and they were green screen for no reason.
There was some definite like CG backgrounds, things that were composited in, but I don't think they did it too much. But I think, your comment about the lighting and stuff probably had a lot to do with the difficulties of shooting nights, probably shooting quickly, probably using a lot of, natural light sources, outdoor light sources, except when you're inside and you've got whatever light setup you have and you've got your dimmer switches going to somehow create atmosphere that way.
But moving back to the shootout scene, there's a part near the end where he has the bullet get followed by the camera through a block of ice. You can tell that there's some stuff where he's trying to do something to keep it interesting. It's not like he doesn't have any idea whatsoever, but he never gets it all together throughout the film.
It's like he feels that if he can get that one shot in there, that will stay in people's minds and they'll think the thing is a lot cooler than it actually is. And he gets very influenced by other films. The shootout in the apartment where there's no lights but everything's lit by the muzzle flares. He totally stole that from Equilibrium. He was like, I thought it worked really cool in that movie, and so I wanted to put it in my movie. They just jacked up the new metal and started firing guns and
But that's how 90s films worked. You just new metal and shooting and badly choreographed fight scenes and muzzle flare up the wazoo at the end when they have you don't see the bullets, you see the bullets whizzing through like you're watching Star Wars and it's lasers.
Yeah,
Did
there's
you?
CG tracer rounds to give
It's
a greater sense of chaos.
and sometimes it might work, but when everything else isn't working, it just seems like it's out of place.
It's like shaking the camera during a fight scene to make it look like the fight is more dynamic than it actually is.
Or during any scene, really. I want to see, actually, you probably can see just people shouting in the legislature and just get the shaky cam going on, and it seems like there's about to be a fight. Someone's about to die.
And play some new metal behind it.
I wish I was better with editing stuff. And I mean, you could create shaky cam effects.
That could actually be a fun experiment to do.
Any editors out there, please hit us up with with your videos of C-SPAN done to new metal.
You started talking about the opening chase scene and fight scene, and it felt pretty hackneyed. And I was really hoping that they would try and do a little bit more with it. It's obviously that first action scene to kind of show the hero doing his thing. Christian Slater is certainly like showing up to do the role. He's not completely phoning it in. But again, I was going to say that it looks like it's shot in a way where they kind of had it rehearsed and then they did the thing, but they didn't really know how to shoot it in a way that was like really truly dynamic. It felt more like a sci-fi network
Which is convenient
movie
because
of the week.
sci-fi did a whole lot of stuff with the Asylum. Any of those Megalodon versus Crocodagatorsaurus, whatever, that's pretty much Asylum, and that's pretty much sci-fi to a
And
T.
and Bull does try to like spice things up when he can. Like he has that one VFX shot with the bullet in the ice, the brick of ice that it shatters. We talked about the apartment firefight with the muzzle flares going on and off and the new metal playing. The final battle at the end, it's supposed to come across as this like huge firefight and there's creatures and there's tracer rounds and stuff. There's definitely visual effects going on, but
And the creatures aren't even super terrible. I mean, for the time, they're each moving around individually. You can tell that it's not completely just rinse and repeat. But at the same time, there's not a whole lot of interaction with the surroundings. They keep that very limited.
the creatures are always shot like at a distance or in soft focus or at night. And I mean, to a certain degree, I understand why they would do that. But in this film, when they make those choices that low budget filmmakers make, which we just don't have the budget to do something more extravagant than this. Usually a good low budget filmmaker will have something going on either story wise or camera wise, or, they'll make the sequence, they'll sell it to you somehow. Whereas this, I don't know what he thinks he's selling you in each of the scenes. And, the characters, they're not working with a great script. There was originally a script, I think, written that was much closer to Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, which was the game. And then Uwe Boll comes in and he's like, no, we're going to make a completely different thing. We want it to be H.P. Lovecraft meets aliens. And it's like, fine, but again, the dialogue is pretty hokey. The actors are doing the best they can with it. But it also feels like once he has them, run through it once or twice, he just goes, okay, we're done. Let's go to the next thing to do another setup or whatever. It feels like he's more concerned with just getting the shots in with the pages done and not actually trying to get like any kind of good performance or lighting setups, or I don't know. I'm really confused with how this movie was made the way it was made.
And by extension, pretty much anything else Uwe Boll does, because they're all sort of made in this way. He always has these big budgets. I mean, some people might say 20, 30 million is not enough, but you can see low budget directors do so much more with that. He's got these big name actors. I mean, Statham, Perlman, Slater, come on. You've got all sorts of names going on in here, but he doesn't know how to use them. He has all the pieces necessary, but just something is missing in his vision.
Either as a director, he doesn't know how to work with actors, which makes me think of the whole Tara Reid situation, which is another thing entirely. Or he doesn't have the time to work with the actors and he's just really hoping that the actors are bringing it. Or I don't even know what the third option would be.
Because he only sees things as individual pieces and not as having an aspect of quality to them. Well, I had this kind of thing. This person had this kind of thing. They got praise. I got dumped on. I don't see the difference. I had a car. They had a car. Yeah, but their car was a Maserati. Yours was a Pinto. It's two cars are not equal.
You're right about the third point being kind of a unified vision. Basically, he might be just seeing the scene and he thinks he's got the scene, but he doesn't really know in his head how it fits in with everything else. And we were talking off mic, and I was telling you about a short film that I made, and everything that could go wrong with it did go wrong. And when I ended up in the editing bay, basically putting it together, thinking I could maybe save it in the edit, there were just so many moments where I was like, oh, if I only had, this extra shot or this line or this close up or this angle or whatever it happened to be. And he might just be like, awesome, we've got it. But he doesn't really know how the movie is going to be beyond just a series of scenes. Like, I'm really curious how he sees the finished product in his head as he's making it.
Because while you might say, well, there's all this stuff that I messed up on or lacked, anytime I've ever heard Uwe Boll talking, he thinks he is a genius. Nothing he ever did was wrong, and he will literally fight you in a boxing match and beat the crap out of you if you criticize anything that he's done, as he was famous for doing.
And as far as the actor thing, I mean, I'd be willing to probably take that one away from him too, or to attribute that to him rather, that he doesn't really know how to work with actors because, like I said, the Tara Reid thing, I mean, he created so much friction between the two of them on set, trying to convince her to get naked for the love scene. She had a no nudity clause in her contract. He was like gaslighting her and pressuring her. And, even in the commentary years later, he's just talking nothing but smack about Tara Reid and talking about how, we put her hair in a bun and gave her glasses. Hope we made her look smart. What do you guys think? And telling the whole story about how she didn't want to take her clothes off and saying, oh, well, she's kind of a train wreck in real life, but she won't take her clothes off for, me on my movie. And maybe I should have got a European actress who'll show some tits and ass because we're not prudes.
Went a little Weinstein on her with talking down about her and saying that she's hard to work with.
And he practically finishes out his commentary on that movie by talking about how Christian Slater and Stephen Dorff, he doesn't understand why they're not A-list actors right now. And then he's like, yeah, this maybe wasn't the movie that Tara Reid should have made at this time. She's kind of physically not right for the part. And I don't know. I'm just like, you're such a dick. I feel like throwing your actors under the bus is kind of a shitty move, especially in the commentary. But I mean, it feeds into that kind of ego creative, genius thing that he seems to kind of believe he is. And yeah, maybe that just creates a scenario where he's not trying too hard because he already thinks he's awesome. So he just keeps doing what he thinks is his thing, which he believes is awesome.
To be fair, people keep giving him millions of dollars to make these movies that everyone else says is terrible. He's basically like Trump, who's out there building houses that are getting condemned for being built improperly, but people keep giving him all this money, and then he gets bankrupt but charges other people and comes out ahead somehow. They both fail forward like madmen.
I will say I haven't seen, I think this might be the only Uwe Boll movie I've seen.
I will say it's not his worst. Seed, I'd say, is the worst. Imagine Uwe Boll trying to make torture porn. Boom. That's all you need to know.
I may have seen another one of his films, but I'd have to look at a filmography to know which one it was. There's such a cookie cutter approach to putting this stuff together that just kind of pissed me off. Like, again, we were talking off mic about this, and to be fair, the story is not a bad story. It's kind of it's a predictable sort of tropey concept, but that doesn't mean it can't be entertaining or executed poorly. Like, it could just be a fun, B-movie, monster movie, even if you're eschewing the whole concept of the video games and just keeping a couple character names.
It's not full of plot holes. It doesn't have weird Deus Ex Machina. Stuff happens that sort of makes sense. The only thing that I would really complain about is Agency 713, was it?
Bureau 731.
Bureau 731 apparently has army battalions just waiting around in every podunk town in America because when they need them in whatever the heck place they're in, they are there. And they are there with the craziest nonsense. I mean, if I was a paranormal researcher, I'd come in with Geiger counter, infrared camera, just some audio recorders to get some ghostly sounds or whatever. But these guys are coming in and they're fully stocked with any kind of military grade nonsense you'd never expect to be needed to fight a ghost.
I do wonder if this was, oh, I should also qualify. It might be Bureau 713. It may not be 731, but I don't have it in my notes and I don't care enough to double check. But just because the nature of podcasting, there's always somebody in their car listening to you, yelling at you when you get something wrong. It's one combination of those three numbers.
I'll only put money down that it starts with a 7.
This movie, it should have been a little more X-Files or Ghostbusters and a little less Aliens, but I wonder if he was looking at a movie like Resident Evil, which was another independently financed horror film based on a video game. Considering the way Boll makes films, he's probably looking at what made money, what do audiences respond to. You know, he's kind of like gaming the system that way, like putting in the things that he thinks are what audiences want to see. And when he kind of decided to full on devote his entire life to adapting video games, there's basic tropes with low budget filmmaking that I think he probably embraces regardless, which is a little bit of blood and guts, a little bit of tits and ass. You want your R rating or your unrating, because that's, people want their visceral B-movie experience. But Resident Evil was a success, and it's an example, and even Tomb Raider, although he kind of shits on Tomb Raider in the commentary. Those were two successful kind of video game adaptations that were not critically greatly received, but commercially received well enough to spawn sequels. But one of my biggest questions with this film, other than sort of the whys and hows of the technical side of it, is why such a departure from the game, which is it has a built-in audience. It's mood and atmosphere, unless maybe that's it. Maybe he can't do mood and atmosphere.
Kind of like how Shyamalan can't do non-expository dialogue.
Having seen his other films, like In the Name of the King and House of the Dead and Blood Rain and whatever, like, do those movies traffic in any kind of decent atmosphere, or are they basically what you would expect?
They don't have the atmosphere. I can't remember Blood Rain too well. I remember In the Name of the King, it felt low budget. They all feel low budget, regardless of whatever budget he has. The plot is never necessarily terrible. It's just there's always something missing, and it's honestly hard to define. I feel like you could have courses on what exactly went wrong here. It's very interesting because some places it's so obvious, but here there's all these pieces that should work: the money, the actors, the decent enough story, but something is just going utterly wrong.
To be fair, the movie does have good scenes, and it does have good ideas, and it does have good moments.
And that's exactly it. It has all these good things, but what is happening that messes up the whole thing? What is going so very wrong with all of this stuff? And the only thing that we can go back to, because I've seen so many of his other films, and they all have these same issues. What is he doing so wrong as a director that somebody else, I could imagine some other director just doing so much more, so better with all of this?
I think if I'm being generous, I'm not going to say he's a bad director per se, but I think he's a bad storyteller, because we just said there are some good elements and some good scenes and some good shots and some good things that he's trying to do with his limited budgets, but those things don't get strung together in any sort of way where you feel a part of it. You're never fully in the movie. And you said something to me where you said you're never in the movie enough to actually be taken out of it. And that's because the connective tissue, where there's some, without actually sitting down and really doing like a breakdown of how he's put these movies together, or this movie in particular, we're not going to solve that problem just in this discussion right now. I don't care to solve that problem in this discussion right now. But it does feel like you're seeing a movie in like Post-it notes. Things just move in this illogical way, and you just sit there questioning. It's like all the pieces seem to be there. It's like maybe they're moving fast enough that you're not noticing where the holes are, but there's definitely some holes. Not plot holes per se, but just holes that are like,
just something missing. Something's not quite right.
Yeah. Clearly, according to Uwe Boll, it's Tara Reid's naked chest.
Was his problem with Tomb Raider that Angelina Jolie didn't show her naked chest?
No, I think his problem with Tomb Raider was that it was a studio film that was more successful than his, because he was talking about the post-production on Alone in the Dark took a long time because they wanted consistency in their CGI, so they just stuck with like one or two vendors, whereas these big $100 million studio movies, they get like 20 different vendors, so sometimes they have good CG, sometimes they have bad CG, all in the same movie. But not my movie. My movie has good CG all the way through.
It was consistent CG. Let's give him that.
I know you you can't say that he was wrong about that. And I didn't mind it.
Honestly, it was less jarring than the liquor in Resident Evil. I mean, 3 years later, but still.
And it was originally the movie was budgeted at something like 10 million, and then the execs saw the script and they greenlit another 10 million and said, "Go make a kick-ass movie." And he said he put most of that money into the special effects. So theoretically, if you're okay with the CG, that's probably why. Although, man, I look at this movie, it's a $20 million movie, and I don't see it. I don't see where the dollars went because, we've talked about John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, and I think that movie was made for like 12 or 13 million, also shot in Canada, also like low budget, financed independently, and I think it was distributed by Universal, I think. Anyways, that movie is just like leagues ahead and away from this movie, which apparently had 7 more million to devote to doing its stuff. So I'm almost thinking that a lot of that money might have ended up in people's pockets.
Given the rumors and the stories that it's primarily a tax shelter, I mean, why not? Let's just throw 4 million at the catering. Why not?
And you look at a movie like Barbarian that just came out, which I think was made for like $4 million. I'll grant you, you can do a lot more with a lot less these days with the way technology and stuff has gone. But still, man, like, I don't
Well, how
know.
much CG did they really need?
I feel like
The creatures were hardly there. There's only a couple of scenes where they're really running around. The tracer rounds, I mean, I feel like those aren't the most difficult things to do since it's not a lot of moving parts. And beyond that, it should have been mostly practical effects, just people running around, stuff getting broken. And they didn't even have proper short circuiting lighting. It was just a bunch of lights on a sort of dimmer switches. If I know how to do that electrical, then it's low budget because I know crap about trying to make lights flicker, and I've heard it's difficult. But in 2005, we had the technology.
this is an example of a movie for me that has enough of the loose ends showing, and it just doesn't make sense kind of how everything adds up. I feel like without, seeing the receipts on this thing, like I just I can't really give it any slack, because it just feels like a completely mismanaged project from top to bottom.
Uva's got feelings, man. That sounds hurtful.
Yeah, I wouldn't even be surprised if he like found this on the internet and listened to it and sent us an angry email or whatever, because he does seem to passionately defend his films when he can.
Well, do not take him up on any boxing match offers because he does not hold back.
That's such a crazy story.
Even if it's for charity, he's going to mess you up. He's trained, man.
We've talked about set pieces. We've talked about how things seem to be put together. We talked about how it seemed to have been decently cast, but that seems to have been squandered. Oh, you know what? Let's talk about the ending.
I did look over the ending again. They leave the place, and all of a sudden it says that the city's been evacuated. I honestly didn't remember the city being evacuated as something that was mentioned at any point. I know that they were trying to make sure that the portal doesn't open, and of course it does open, and they close another chamber door, and nothing seemed to have gotten out. But then all of a sudden, the entire city is evacuated, and they're just walking through this 28 days later wasteland. And I was just confused as to when that all happened.
So this is a case, again, of Mr. Boll coming up with an idea that he thought was pretty great, and he says he's caught a lot of flack for. I don't know if he understands what evacuate means, because I think, he made a reference to the Abkhani disappearing off the face of the earth, and he had this lofty idea about the theme of this film being the revenge of nature against civilization, basically with man encroaching on the dark spaces and bringing light to the dark spaces. We're essentially taking away the natural habitat of these dark dwelling creatures, which
They have a natural habitat. It's a different dimension. Get out of here.
it's such a bizarre sort of Like it feels like he's trying to make some sort of, political commentary or ecological commentary and reveal himself as this great naturalist, but just doing it in the weirdest way possible. He said that basically the city's been evacuated, much like the Abkhani have disappeared. There's a couple of monster roars that you can hear. So he's like, the city is empty, but maybe there's still some creatures around. And basically, the earth is kind of being overrun. And these are your last two people. And maybe now
How?
they're.
It just happened like 40 minutes ago.
I know.
Simmer down.
I know. And then he's like, and maybe our heroes are dead because they have that last shot, which is supposed to leave you, leaving the theater all excited with what just happened. It makes no sense. It's, maybe this is a nice way to sort of sum up a lot of what we were talking about with how he said that there's just stuff missing. He thought this was a cool idea. He threw it in. He shot it. He spent the money. He put it in the movie. It's in the final cut. We don't know how we got there. In his head, it works, but it doesn't work in the actual artifact of cinema that he's created. Because I don't know what happened. You don't know what happened. We can suppose what happened. And based on the commentary, what I kind of assumed happened is probably exactly what happened in his mind, but it doesn't make sense how it happened.
Because if they succeeded at closing the gate and then walked out, but then it just so happened that the creatures got everything. And as it said that there was an evacuation, but they show like an office and all the chairs are knocked over, like people just ran out like madmen. There's no cars in the street somehow.
I did like that shot of the cat.
To evacuate a major metropolitan center, like that would take hours, not 4.5 minutes.
Even in Canada.
Even in Canada, where we all live 40 kilometers from each other.
It's just a bizarre thing. It's just a bizarre group of scenes and set pieces and ideas just kind of strung together. I don't know. I was leery about going into this because I know how badly it's been received, but the fact that it has like a special edition, collector's edition, Shout Factory or Arrow release, I can't remember which boutique studio released it, but I felt like there's an audience out there. This might be one of those not great movies, but kind of a diamond in the rough, or at least a zirconium in the rough. But yeah, man, I'll be happy to just never visit this thing again.
And that's saying something, because normally you're all about looking at these films that you don't like and finding something in them at the expense of rewatching movies you do like, which that's Mike, ladies and gentlemen.
That is true facts. About halfway through this movie, I thought to myself, this might possibly be the dumbest movie that we've covered on the show. And then I thought, well, maybe Martyrs 2015. But then I realized Martyrs 2015 was still kind of a competently made film. It just really shit on a movie that both of us think is a genuine masterpiece. And it kind of made me more angry than anything else. Whereas I think this movie is just dumb.
Knowing the original Martyrs is why I hate Martyrs 2015 so much more, because they wrecked so much of it. And you can see all the stuff that they did there so blatantly, how they managed to sexualize it while simultaneously making it PG-13. Like that's a masterclass in fucking it up. It doesn't work in any way, shape, or form. And if you want to hear more of our rants about it, watch that episode or listen to that episode. Watching it would be rather awkward. So I don't think this is the worst film that we've covered, or at least not the one that upsets me the most. How about that?
Like I said, I mean, this one doesn't upset me. I just think it's dumb. I mean, we've covered.
I also cover, in case you were considering. So I specifically watched worse films.
This is also true. And then
I hear that the sequel that they did to Alone in the Dark, however, was better.
Oh, for real?
Yeah. Well, it wasn't Uwe Boll, first off.
That's true. That's true. They recast Edward Carnby. Lance Henriksen is in it.
I wonder if you could almost say that Uwe Boll sort of lives in the uncanny valley of filmmaking. If something's bad enough, it's all right. If something's good enough, it's good. But there's a certain point where there's enough of the good pieces that it's just not working together. It's like, this is supposed to be good, but it's not. And it weirds you out in such a way that you can't even explain, like a porcelain doll.
Did you have a nightmare? My mommy says that there's nothing to be afraid of in the dark.
Your mother's wrong, kid. Being afraid of the dark is what keeps most of us alive.
So that's a big not recommend for me. Dustin, I'm assuming you're in the same camp?
Yeah, I'm in the not recommend, not just this film, but basically anything Uwe Boll does. It's not really worth your time.
Just a blanket not recommend.
I'm not recommending movies we aren't even talking about.
So that's where Dustin and I fell on Alone in the Dark. We'd be curious to know where you fell. I know as a whole, the internet and the world thinks this is one of the worst films ever made, but maybe somebody out there is a big fan, and I'm always looking for an entryway into a movie that I don't like. So if you have thoughts on this movie, a defense of this movie, we'd love to hear it. Hit us up on our social media, either on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or in the comments section of the YouTube channel. We are at FYC Show or For Your Consideration on all of those platforms. While you're there, if the option is available to rate or review the show, please do so. It really helps with the algorithms and getting the show into the eyes and ears of people who may enjoy this programming but don't know that we are currently producing it. And also, like, follow, share, and subscribe across the board so that you never miss an episode. And speaking of never missing an episode, Dustin, next week we are talking about
2005's Doom, starring Carl Urban and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson and other people.
Directed by Andrzej Bartkowiak, primarily a cinematographer who's made a handful of films.
And I will trust your pronunciation on that, given your Eastern European heritage.
So thanks for checking us out this week. Be sure to join us next week. And until then, I hope everybody's staying healthy, staying happy, staying safe. I have been your host, Mike.
I've been your other host, Dustin.
Take care, and we'll see you in the next installment of our October Frightfest Spooktacular.
Bye-bye now.
I wonder